You know, every time you shop online, visit a doctor, or just scroll through your phone, you're creating this digital footprint. But have you ever stopped to think, who's actually in charge of all that data? Who gets to decide how it's used? Well, today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the UK's Data Protection Act of 2018, the rulebook that's supposed to put you back in the driver's seat.
So, here's our game plan. First, we'll get right to the heart of what the DPA even is. Then, we'll look at how it teams up with the famous UK GDPR. After that, we'll dive into the rights you actually have, explore why some of your information gets extra special protection, and then we'll look at the surprising times when all those rules can actually change. And finally, we'll meet the watchdog with the power to enforce it all.
All right, let's jump right in. Section 1. What is the DPA? Think of it as the official rulebook for your digital footprint.
Let's start with a really basic but super important question. When you give a company your information, who's really calling the shots? Who's in control? This is the exact problem that the Data Protection Act of 2018 was built to solve. It's the UK's big answer to that very question.
Okay, so the absolute core of this law comes down to two words: personal data. And listen, this is way more than just your name or your email address. We're talking about your IP address, your location data, your browsing history, pretty much anything that can be used to identify you as a person. And the DPA is the law that tells every single organization how they have to treat it. So what's its main job? Well, it's kind of juggling four big things at once. First, it sets the ground rules for handling your data. Second, it works hand in hand with another big law, which we'll get to in a sec. Third, and this is the part that really matters to you and me, it spells out our rights. And finally, it creates a whole separate high-stakes rulebook for areas like law enforcement and national security.
Which brings us to Section 2, the UK GDPR connection. You see, you really can't understand the DPA without talking about its very famous partner. They're two laws, but they're working towards one goal.
Think of it like this. The UK GDPR, that's the foundation. It's the big, overarching set of principles for data protection. It's the general rulebook that basically every organization has to play by.
And this slide really nails the difference. The UK GDPR on the left, that's the general framework. But the Data Protection Act on the right, that's the UK's specific, detailed instruction manual. It fills in the gaps, it tailors the rules for the UK, and it gets into the weeds on tricky stuff like national security, things the main regulation leaves up to individual countries to figure out.
So let's move on. Section 3, your data, your rights. Okay, so what does all this legal stuff actually mean for you on a daily basis? Let's get into the good stuff. The power this law actually gives you. The entire act is really built on these key principles. It means anyone using your data has to do it lawfully and be straight with you. They can only use it for the reason they told you about. No secret side projects. They can't just hoover up a ton of data they don't need. And critically, if they have information on you, they have to make sure it's accurate. But what about a really modern problem? I mean, we live in a world where an algorithm, a piece of code, could be the thing that decides if you get a mortgage or a job interview. So, does the Act have anything to say about that? Oh, it absolutely does, and this is where you get some real power. If a big decision about you is made only by an automated system, you have specific rights. As you can see, first, they have to tell you it happened. Second, you can stick your hand up and say, I want a human to look at this. And third, you have the right to challenge that computer's decision. Okay, next up, the special cases. The Act is smart enough to know that not all data is the same. Some of your information is so personal, so sensitive, that it needs a much higher wall built around it. This is what the law officially calls special categories of personal data. And we're talking about the really sensitive stuff here. Your race, your political leanings, your health records, your religious beliefs. The law puts this data in a vault, basically, because if it's misused, it could cause real harm or discrimination. So, because this data is so sensitive, the default setting is no. You can't process it. It's off limits. Unless you have a very specific, legitimate key to unlock that vault. For example, a doctor obviously needs to process your health data to treat you, but these exceptions are narrow and they are very, very tightly controlled. All right, now for a really interesting part, when the rules change. We've talked a lot about your rights and all these protections, but it's just as important to understand when those rights can actually be put on pause. This is where we get into the exemptions.
Let's just reset for a second. The core idea, the bedrock of this whole system, is that you have fundamental rights over your own data. That's the starting point. That is the default.
But then you have this. And I want to read this line directly from the Act because the wording is so powerful. It says, a minister's certificate is conclusive evidence that an exemption is needed for national security. Just think about that phrase, conclusive evidence. It basically means that when national security is invoked, the conversation is over. The government gets the power to bypass your rights.
So the big takeaway here is that your rights, as important as they are not absolute. This table shows the main balancing acts in the law. National security is the biggest exception, for sure. But your rights can also be limited for things like journalism, scientific research, or preventing crime. It's always a trade-off between your individual privacy and some other important public interest.
And that brings us to our final section. Who enforces the act? I mean, with all these complex rules and rights and exemptions, who is the referee? Who's making sure everybody is actually playing by the rules?
That massive job belongs to the Information Commissioner's Office, or the ICO for short. They are the UK's independent data watchdog. Their entire reason for existing is to protect our information rights and make sure companies are doing what they're supposed to.
And they have a huge to-do list. They're part educator, making sure we all know our rights. They're part detective, investigating data breaches when things go wrong. And they're part advisor, helping the government keep the laws relevant. They aren't just reacting. They're actively trying to shape the future of data protection in the UK.
And this is important. The ICO has real teeth. They aren't just making polite suggestions. They can issue official warnings and force companies to change their ways. They can levy massive fines, and as you can see, they can even get a warrant, walk right into an office and inspect the servers themselves. They mean business.
So, there you have it. The Data Protection Act, a really complex but vital piece of law designed for our digital age. But as we wrap up, it leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? In a world of ever smarter AI and technology that's changing by the minute, are the rules we have today going to be enough to protect us tomorrow? Something to think about. Thanks for tuning in.